Question for short debate. Resources to deliver the Imprisonment for Public Protection Action Plan. The time limit is 1 hour. Lord Moylan.
I leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper. I am not proposing to rehearse the history of this sentence, which I think is well known to most of the participants in the chamber. I think this is an opportunity for looking forward rather than looking back. But to summarise the basic facts, there are 2,892 IPP prisoners in prison. 1,498 of those are on remand. 1,394 have never been released, and nearly all of those have served their minimum term, in many cases well over their minimum term. The difficulty of completing the hurdles required for progression to release, the lengthy 10-year statutory parole period, and the ease with which one can be yanked back into the prison system have made this scandal both intractable for the authorities and a continuing mental torture for the prisoners and their families. Hence the optimism when the Justice Select Committee in another place produced their report last year, their, I would say, courageous and morally unarguable report, drawing attention to the scandal and the suffering and recommending some clear ways of cutting this Gordian knot through resentencing. Now, the government's rejection of that was perhaps not unexpected by some. It wasn't unexpected by me, to be perfectly honest, but it has had a devastating effect on the mental health of prisoners and their families alike. One of the most dangerous things here is raising hopes, only to see them dashed. Instead, the government has offered an action plan by way of response to the committee's report. And this is your Lordship's House first opportunity, I think, to review and consider the action plan. What can one say about it? Well, first of all, it is a welcome advance on the previous action plan, which consisted of 2 sides of paper. This, at least, is a serious effort, and it has a great deal of detail. Secondly, it does have a plan, and it does have a timetable, and both of those things are very much to be welcomed. And thirdly, I know from ministerial assurances that its implementation has been entrusted to competent and experienced civil servants, and I welcome that and have confidence in them. But it is yet to be seen if it is the transformative approach that we are looking for that will help to resolve this issue. First of all, it fails to acknowledge the injustice that is lying at the heart of this problem. Now, the Secretary of State, the Lord Chancellor, the new one, appears to be moving in that direction. In the other place recently, in a debate on the Victims' Bill, he referred to the IPP regime as a stain, possibly in that echoing comments previously made by the noble Lord and noble and learned Lord Brown of Eton under Hayward. And in a letter I've recently seen, he refers to it as an iniquity. Now, these are new terms. This is new language. We have not heard this language from the Ministry of Justice in the past. And it's wholly welcome that the acknowledgement of the injustice should be there coming from the Secretary of State himself. But is it properly reflected in the action plan, which it must be said was prepared? He signed it off, but it had been prepared before he came into office. Does the action plan read still too much like an administrative task rather than what I think it should be, which is a morally based mission? The second thing I'd say is that it fails to respond fully to what we know are the challenges faced by prisoners who are out on parole. Being on parole for a lengthy 10-year period, constantly set by statute as a minimum, despite our efforts in this House to have it reduced when we considered the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill a year or two ago, being out for 10 years, constantly under threat of being pulled back into jail for what is in effect a life sentence, the difficulty of rebuilding one's life in those circumstances, I think one cannot underestimate the fragility of the person who has to carry that. You would have to be a very, very strong person indeed to be able to carry that and live with it and make your life work well. And finally, I'd say, and there are other comments that can be made about it, it implicitly assumes that prisoners will engage in good faith and rationally with the new approach. Now, the sad fact of the matter is that prisoners have lost their faith in the system, and simply turning up and saying it's all different now and we're going to make it work, it requires a great deal more than that. One really does have to understand that these people are very fragile and very damaged. And it doesn't, I think, acknowledge that or coherently think how to approach them and engage with them. Or indeed, for that matter, with their families, who are potentially a very important part of helping to resolve this issue. So I would like to say a few words before I finish about mental health, because one of the things that's happened to me in the last 6 or 8 months as a result of being involved in this is that I've got to know psychologists better who are working in the field, and some of them have approached me, and one gets involved, and previously I didn't have those contacts. And it's worth just repeating a few of the things they say. The first is to emphasize that these are damaged people. The second is, as was identified in the Justice Select Committee's report, they have a tendency to hide that damage because they know that if they admit to mental health problems, it makes it more difficult for them to get their parole. And therefore they tend to hide it rather than look for treatment and support. They are, many of them, constantly on the verge of suicide and self-harm. And I think I understand there have been at least 3 suicides since the Secretary of State rejected the resentencing proposal. I understand that in general the rate of suicide amongst IPP prisoners is double that of the normal prison population. So I think these things need to be borne in mind as examples of completely understandable suffering. One psychologist commented that they now think in the same way as somebody who has been sentenced wrongly, who has been sentenced for a crime they didn't commit. Now, it's important to unpackage that, because they all acknowledge that they have been sentenced for a crime they did commit, and they all acknowledge that they should do time in jail. But the fact that that time never seems to come to an end has put them in the same mental place as prisoners who have been wrongly convicted. And that's not a good place to be if you're in prison. It is much better, of course, to be there knowing that you did something wrong, acknowledging that you have to pay the penalty, but knowing that you'll leave in due course when that penalty has been paid. They're in great difficulty. So what I'd like to see, and what I'd like to hear when my noble friend comes to speak, my noble and learned friend comes to speak towards the end, is the action plan could be improved by, first of all, a sense of the scandal and the urgency and the harm that underlie the problem, rather than purely an administrative problem. I would like to see a credible plan for removing the obstacles to those in prison from completing the progression steps they have to in order to qualify for parole and for release into the community. I would like to see a radical reduction in the parole period. And most importantly, I would like to see resources and support given to the parole service, because that has always been the Cinderella of this problem, and without proper resources for the parole service, it will not be maintained.